In a recent video, we covered the losses the Russian military suffered in the war in Ukraine. Though the news is mostly reporting on Russian losses,
after nearly 7 months of fighting, Ukraine has finally begun to regain some of the territory it lost to Russia. It says its forces are continuing their rapid advance in several areas, including the northern Kharkiv region in the past few days, forcing Moscow to pull back its forces. It's raised the question of how far they can go.
It doesn't mean that Ukrainian forces suffer no losses. In contrast to Russia, nobody really knew anything about the Ukrainian military before the war. That was not really much to be known, honestly. Most of their equipment was of Soviet origin, and although their stocks of tanks and other fighting vehicles were pretty high, it was nothing to write home about. So how on earth is it even possible that the Russian military, which is ranked third in the military strength rating, has not yet destroyed the Ukrainians? It is the tactics, morale of the individual soldiers, Western-donated equipment, or bad Russian logistics. Well, all these reasons would deserve an individual video of their own, since they all contributed to the failure of the Russian army in Ukraine. So, in this video, we would like to look at the history of the Ukrainian army, look at Ukrainian losses, compare them to Russian losses, and lastly, discuss the Ukrainian ability to replenish their army. As it has been a recurring theme in these videos, we will have to go back in time to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. By 1992, the Ukrainian armed forces had been entirely inherited from the Soviet army, in which Ukraine had been a member state. Like other Soviet republics, it did not possess its own separate military command. Administratively, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was divided into 3 Soviet military districts. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the newly independent state of Ukraine inherited one of the most powerful force groupings in Europe. According to James Schur, an associate of the Conflict Studies Research Center, this grouping, its inventory of equipment, and its officer corps was designed for one purpose: to wage combined arms, coalition, offensive, and nuclear warfare against NATO on an external front. At the time, the former Soviet armed forces in the Ukrainian SSR were a large portion of the Soviet Air Force, and a vast air defense army, as Ukraine was geographically in a good position to place air defenses against incoming threats from Europe. The heritage also included 2 tank armies, consisting of thousands of tanks, or a significant portion of the Black Sea Fleet. On top of that, Ukraine was left with 2 divisions of the Strategic Rocket Forces, which of course operated the Soviet nuclear missiles. However, Ukraine did not have any operational control over these weapons. You see, their usage was dependent on the Russian command and control system, and that's why Ukraine voluntarily gave up all nuclear weapons in the early 1990s, becoming the first country in history to do so. This was a significant step towards Ukraine becoming the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state, but this treaty sadly also included the dismantlement of many nuclear-capable strategic bombers, and most notably, cruise missiles. Ukraine was not only in a very good position to be used for air defense systems, but also to be used as a launching site for cruise missiles. Kiev had to destroy 11 Tu-160 and 27 Tu-95 bombers and about 500 km 55 air-launched cruise missiles. Another 11 heavy bombers and 582 strategic cruise missiles were transferred to Russia under a 1999 agreement as payment for natural gas debts. These are the very same missiles and bombers that Russia now uses against Ukraine. While those were the times when the West did not really consider Russia to unleash a full-on war in Ukraine, it is worth noting that the Ukrainian armed forces have undergone modernization and reform since 2014, which includes the purchase of new equipment, training, and reform of the command structure. Nonetheless, the Ukrainian army is still facing a significant challenge in terms of the number and quality of its equipment, which is much lower compared to the Russian army, though the tide may be turning in favor of Ukraine, and we will soon see how. So, now that we know the origins of the modern Ukrainian army, what does it look like today, after almost a year of intense fighting? Well, there's not a clear answer to this question. The Ukrainian losses are much smaller than that of Russia. They naturally had a much small army to begin with. Just a couple of numbers to paint a clearer picture of the situation: Ukraine lost about 500 tanks, 1,000 fighting vehicles, about 200 artillery pieces, and most notably more than 50 aircraft, almost half of their air force. Excluding the aircraft, a significant portion, about 35% of these weapons was also captured by Russian soldiers. We must also say that given that these numbers are sourced from Oryx, which only counts visually confirmed losses, the actual losses are going to likely be much higher. To keep the numbers coherent, the numbers describing Russian military losses are going to be also sourced from there. We will leave a link to Oryx's website in the description, so if you want to dig into detail about what exactly has been lost, be sure to visit it. So what are the losses on Russia's side? Significantly higher, and not only the losses, but but also there's a percentage of captured equipment. To make it simple, the number of Russian equipment lost is generally 3 times higher than the Ukrainian. It always amazes us that pretty much the same number of tanks that Ukrainian lost was also captured. But on the other hand, Ukrainians are reportedly in desperate needs of all sorts of munition. Artillery shells, mortar shells, and missiles have been running low. It's no joke trying to reciprocate Russian fire. At the beginning of the war at least, Russia still had stockpiles full of shells from the Cold War era and thousands of missiles. Though Russia is not only brimful of munition anymore, Ukraine is definitely in worse shape as it is now entirely dependent on NATO and its allies when it comes to resupplying the artillery. To make matters even worse, according to US intelligence, some 100,000 soldiers have been lost on both sides. This is mostly bad news for Ukraine, because it had much fewer soldiers to begin with. Counting in the newly mobilized Russian units, it's approximately 3 Russian soldiers for every Ukrainian soldier. But if there is anything positive about this, it's the fact that its NATO countries provide training for many of the newly conscripted Ukrainian soldiers. And this means that soldiers are being rotated to the front line. They're not only the tired soldiers who've been going back and forth between the front line and their military base since the beginning of the war, but also fresh soldiers who have just finished training in Britain, Poland, or other allied countries. And by training, we mean actual training, not the training Russia provides their soldiers with. So what do we learn here? Losses are high on both sides, but when it comes to equipment, Russia has really suffered much more than Ukraine and will have a hard time replenishing its stock. Ukraine, on the other hand, has bright days ahead. Many NATO countries have really started taking military aid seriously, with Germany finally supporting the transfer of Leopard 2 from a coalition of NATO countries to Ukraine, and the US preparing to send Abrams tanks or Strider fighting vehicles, weapons that have proved to be highly capable against Soviet equipment, which Russia mainly uses. The UK has already committed to sending Challenger 2 tanks, and France is about to send their infantry fighting vehicles and possibly even Leclerc tanks, and much more deliveries are hopefully to be expected in the coming months. With that being said, let's hope this war will soon become unviable for Putin ASAP. Thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more war-related content. If you would like to know more details about Russia's losses in Ukraine, be sure to visit the channel, as we have an entire video covering this topic.